41 cities, Senator J.D. Vance said, and he did not say it like a statistic pulled from a committee memo. He said it like a charge being read into the record before the defendant had time to blink. His voice was low, deliberate, stripped of ornament, the kind of voice Washington hates because it does not give the room anywhere to hide. 41 American communities were told this program would make them stronger, he continued. And across the table, Representative Ilhan Omar sat composed, polished, protected by the kind of practiced calm that comes from years of turning moral language into political armor. They were told the federal government would fund the transition. They were told their schools would receive support. They were told their housing systems would not be overwhelmed. And above all, they were told their voices would be heard before a single placement was made. Then, Vance looked directly at Omar and made the entire hearing smaller, tighter, more dangerous, because suddenly this was not about abstract policy, not about a slogan, not about another humanitarian press release dressed up as accountability, but about one basic question: what happened? This was the final oversight hearing before the Senate Homeland Security Subcommittee voted on whether to reauthorize the Federal Refugee Community Placement Initiative, known as FRCPI, a program that had fast-tracked refugee family placements into 41 mid-sized American cities. The promise had been simple enough to sell and vague enough to survive cable news. Schools would get integration specialists. Cities would get housing support. Job readiness programs would be funded. And communities would be consulted before Washington placed new burdens on them. Representative Omar had co-authored the enabling legislation in the House, championed it on the floor, defended it in public, promoted it in press conferences, and told receiving communities they would become, in her words, stronger, not strained. That phrase mattered because it was not some accidental flourish, not a throwaway line lost in a long speech, but the central promise, the emotional contract, the clean little slogan meant to make pressure sound like progress. And now, 72 hours before the reauthorization vote, Vance was putting that phrase on trial in front of the cameras, with 41 cities watching from far outside the comfort of Washington's committee rooms. Omar opened exactly the way anyone familiar with her style would expect, with controlled warmth, moral certainty, and enough rhetorical polish to make failure sound like unfinished compassion. She said she appreciated the opportunity to testify, said the program represented America at its best, said it welcomed families fleeing danger, invested in communities, and built something together. Because that is the language officials use when the numbers are ugly and the theory still needs to sound beautiful. She admitted the first year was not perfect, but framed reauthorization as a duty, not a choice, arguing that America owed it to every community to finish what had been started. It was smooth, disciplined, almost too smooth, because nothing in that answer touched the lived reality of the towns, now stuck carrying the weight of a program that had arrived with promises and delivered invoices. Vance nodded, let the answer breathe, and then did what seasoned operators in Washington fear most. He accepted her premise just long enough to use it against her. He said he knew she cared about these communities, and that line was not kindness. It was a setup, because if she cared, then her absence would matter. And if she championed the program, then its collapse could not be blamed entirely on nameless administrators buried somewhere inside the federal machine. He explained that he had visited all 3 Ohio receiving cities in the previous 2 months: Dayton, Springfield, and Zanesville. He had sat in school cafeterias built for 400 children that were now trying to serve nearly 700. Talked to teachers who had not received a raise in 3 years while their classrooms doubled overnight, and spoken with families whose property taxes rose to cover costs they had been told Washington would pay. The point was not that refugee families were the villain, and Vance did not need to say that because the real accusation was far more politically lethal. The villain was the system that made promises in marble buildings, transferred the pressure to local neighborhoods, then acted offended when those neighborhoods asked for receipts. Then came the question, clean and direct, The kind that does not require drama because the answer either exists or it does not. Representative Omar, when was the last time you visited any of the 41 receiving cities? Omar's answer slowed by a beat, and in hearings like this, one beat is a confession with better manners. She said she had maintained close contact with program administrators and received regular briefings on implementation progress across all sites. She did not name a city, did not offer a date, did not mention a school cafeteria, a tax bill, a school board meeting, a teacher, a family, a mayor, a superintendent, or a single human being who had actually absorbed the consequences of the program she helped sell. Vance did not interrupt, did not pounce, did not perform outrage, because the non-answer was already doing the damage for him. He simply allowed it to sit there, in the room, heavy and obvious, the way unanswered letters must have sat in inboxes, while Omar appeared on television, insisting the program was working. Then, he reached for the thick folder sitting beside him, the one with color-coded tabs running down the side, and the atmosphere changed in the room, because everyone in Washington understands the difference between a senator with questions and a senator with documents. Behind Omar, her chief of staff leaned forward, eyes tracking the folder, because it was thicker than anyone on her side seemed to expect, and because thickness in a hearing room usually means somebody miscalculated what the other side had found. Vance began with one number. Not a speech, not a theory, just one number. The total appropriated budget for year one. Omar answered immediately. $847 million, clean and confident, because that was the number designed for the podium. The number large enough to sound generous, serious, federal, responsible. Then Vance asked how many receiving cities there were, and when Omar answered 41, he did the math Washington had apparently hoped nobody at home would bother to do. Divided evenly, he said, that would mean roughly $20.6 million in federal support for each city. And Omar quickly clarified that distribution was not designed to be perfectly even, because allocations were scaled to population density, existing infrastructure, and projected placement volume. That was technically useful and politically evasive, the kind of answer that sounds sophisticated until someone opens the actual files. Vance said he understood, then moved to the 3 Ohio cities. Zanesville had been projected to receive $14.2 million and received $6.1. Springfield had been projected at $17.8 and received $9.3. And Dayton had been projected at $22.5 and received $11.9. He set the page down and asked the question no official wants attached to a missing pile of money. These are not rounding errors. Where did the difference go? And that was when the first real crack appeared, not in Omar's voice yet, but in the architecture of the defense itself, because once the money trail entered the room, the moral language could no longer carry the whole performance. Omar explained that federal funding moved through a pipeline with administrative costs at each level, a phrase so bloodless it could only have been born inside a bureaucracy. Vance asked what percentage she estimated had been lost to overhead, and she said approximately 12%. Then he read the preliminary government accountability assessment, 23%, nearly double her estimate, and he did not need to sneer because the number sneered for him. He did not editorialize, did not pound the table, did not chase applause, because the cleanest humiliation in politics is often just placing the official claim beside the official record and letting the audience decide which one looks like a lie. But that was only the first tab in the folder, and the darker problem was not merely that the money had thinned out before reaching the cities. It was what disappeared with it. The next page was about school integration specialists, the people who were supposed to be hired locally with federal funds, the people who were supposed to keep classrooms from becoming pressure cookers, where teachers were asked to solve demographic, linguistic, and social problems with no support and no time. If the funds did not arrive, Vance asked, were the specialists hired? Omar answered with the usual institutional fog. Hiring challenges, competitive labor market, compressed timelines, implementation pressures, all the soft phrases that mean the promise failed, but nobody wants to say who broke it. Then Vance read the number. 7 specialists deployed across 41 cities, over 30,000 new students, and 7 people to help them integrate. And the room did the math before he had to, because sometimes the most brutal sentence in a hearing is the one everyone silently completes in their own head. But even that was not the bottom of it, because missing money can be blamed on process, missing staff can be blamed on timelines, and broken schools can be dressed up as transition pain. The real danger was what came next. The promise Washington had made, not to budgets, not to agencies, not to advocacy groups, but to the people themselves. Community consultation was supposed to be the firewall, the sacred assurance that no city would be treated like a storage unit for federal ambition before local residents had a voice. Vance was not there yet, but the folder was moving in that direction, and Omar's team could see it before the audience could. Because if the consultation promise failed, too, then this was no longer a rough rollout. It was something much harder to excuse, a political machine that asked communities to trust it, then quietly made the decision without them. And from there, the hearing moved into the part Washington always tries to bury under process language. Because once the promised money failed to reach the cities, and the promised school support barely existed, the next question was not technical anymore. It was moral. Vance turned back to the folder and explained the chain without raising his voice, because rage would have given Omar something to react to, while the facts gave her nowhere to stand. The funding did not arrive in full. The specialists were not hired. The classrooms absorbed the pressure. The cafeterias stretched beyond capacity, and families who had been told the federal government would carry the cost watched their local tax bills climb instead. In Zanesville, the shortfall tied to FRCPI exceeded the city's entire annual parks budget, meaning the gap between Washington's promise and Washington's delivery was bigger than the money used for playgrounds, ball fields, public pools, and basic community life. That is the kind of detail politicians hate, because it turns policy failure into something ordinary people can actually see. A ball field not maintained, a pool not repaired, a family opening a property tax statement, and realizing compassion in Washington had just become another bill at home. Omar tried to push back by pointing to other federal programs with bipartisan support that had also struggled in their first years. But Vance did not chase the analogy because the analogy was a door leading away from the crime scene. He brought the room back to the budget, back to the numbers, back to the press release her office had issued 7 months earlier, claiming that FRCPI had delivered $593 million in direct community support. Then he read what the GAO survey found after contacting all 41 cities. The total those cities reported actually receiving was $311 million. He let the gap hang there, nearly $300 million of political daylight, between what Omar's office told the American people and what the communities said had actually reached them. And he did not even need to ask where the money went, because by that point the question was already forming in every living room, every break room, every school board member's head, and every taxpayer's clenched jaw. That was when Omar changed tactics, because when the numbers start losing, the professional political instinct is to attack the messenger's moral standing. She leaned forward and said she respected Vance's concern for Ohio communities, but then she turned the blade and asked where that concern had been when the factories in Zanesville closed, when the opioid crisis hollowed out neighborhoods, when Main Street storefronts went dark, when families were burying their children. It was a sharp counterattack, and for a moment it landed, because it turned the hearing from a review of FRCPI into a referendum on whether Vance had earned the right to speak for places that had suffered long before this program arrived. She said these communities were struggling before FRCPI, underfunded, overlooked, politically invisible, and now, only now, when there was a program to attack and a camera to speak into, he had found them. Then she delivered the line meant to flip the entire room. She had spent her career fighting for struggling communities, while the senator from Ohio had found his last month. The blow had force because it contained enough truth to create discomfort, and the gallery felt it. The staffers felt it. Even the senators pretending to read their papers felt it. For a brief second, the hearing tilted, because Omar was no longer defending missing money or failed implementation. She was accusing Vance of selective outrage, and selective outrage is the native language of Washington. But then she kept going. And that is where seasoned politicians often destroy themselves, not with the prepared attack, but with the extra sentence they did not need. She said she understood that some people were afraid of the program, but she did not come to Congress to govern by fear. She came to do what was right, even when it was not popular in certain communities. Certain communities, 2 words dropped into the hearing like a lit match, because she meant them as a defense of moral courage. But the people watching in those 41 cities heard something much colder. They heard a woman who had not named the last receiving city she visited reduce their lived experience to fear. They heard the property tax increases, the overcrowded classrooms, the unanswered letters, the skipped consultations, and the missing support get folded into one patronizing category, as if practical objections from local families were just anxiety from people too small-minded to appreciate Washington's moral vision. That was the danger of the phrase, not that it was loud, but that it revealed the hierarchy sitting underneath the whole program. Washington decides, communities absorb, and if they object, their objection becomes fear. Vance did not answer immediately, and for once the silence did not feel tactical, because Omar's earlier accusation about his late arrival in these places had clearly landed. Then he did the one thing that took the weapon out of her hand. He conceded the part that was true. "You are right," he said, and the room stilled because nobody expected him to say it. He admitted he had not been in Zanesville during the opioid crisis, admitted he could not change the fact that he found these communities late, and by conceding that flaw openly, he denied Omar the chance to keep using it as a shield for her own absence. Then his voice hardened beneath the calm, because the point was not whether he had arrived late. The point was that Omar had been there from the beginning, with the authority, the access, the authorship, and the obligation. "You championed this program from day one," he pressed, and the implication was brutal because it did not require exaggeration. If he was late, she was responsible, and those are not the same thing. The people in those 41 cities were not waiting for him, he said in effect. They were waiting for the person who told them they would be stronger. He reminded the room that while letters from those communities sat unanswered, Omar had made 11 cable news appearances telling the country the program was working. Omar tried to reframe that as media advocacy, as part of defending a humanitarian program under political attack. But the energy had shifted because she was no longer driving the hearing. She was managing damage. Vance wrote down the phrase, "certain communities," and said he wanted to return to it later, because he believed it explained everything that had gone wrong with the program. And that was the moment Omar's expression changed, because she could see the phrase being loaded into the record, turned from a passing line into a political indictment. But the real trap had not closed yet, because the next section was not about what she thought of those communities. It was about whether she had helped take away the one thing she promised them before the program ever began: their voice. Vance reset his tone almost completely before moving into community consultation. And that was what made the next section more dangerous, because he stopped sounding like a prosecutor and started sounding like a man asking someone to explain a promise. He asked Omar to describe the consultation framework FRCPI had sold to the 41 receiving cities, and she straightened in her chair because this was ground she understood, ground built for polished language and public-facing confidence. She described local input sessions, coordination with municipal leaders, impact assessments, and 90-day public comment windows before any city received placements. She called it one of the strongest community engagement frameworks ever built into a federal resettlement program, And she said it with the kind of certainty that suggested she still believed the architecture of the promise mattered, even if the building had already collapsed. Then, Vance asked the one question that stripped the architecture down to the studs. How many of the 41 cities completed the full consultation process before receiving their first placements? He did not wait long before reading from the program's own internal quarterly report, the same kind of report that moves through official inboxes quietly until somebody brings it into a room with cameras. 0 out of 41. The words did not need decoration, because 0 is one of those numbers even Washington cannot soften with implementation language. Omar had just described a framework as if it were proof of responsibility, and Vance had just shown that the framework had existed mostly as a brochure, a promise on paper, a democratic ritual designed to reassure communities before the decision was made without them. And for the people watching from those cities, that number did not sound like a bureaucratic failure. It sounded like confirmation that their suspicion had been right from the beginning. Omar pushed back by saying the framework was correctly designed, but implementation had been accelerated because of humanitarian urgency. Families were in danger, timelines had to compress, and placement speed had to take priority. It was the moral emergency argument, the emergency button Washington presses whenever it wants to explain why normal consent, normal oversight, and normal accountability had to be suspended just this once. But that defense carried its own poison, because if speed justified skipping consultation, then consultation had never really been a guarantee, only a courtesy available when it did not slow the plan down. Then Omar said the sentence that changed the hearing. They had made the decision to prioritize placement speed because families were in danger. She had been involved in those conversations, and she stood by that decision. She said it with conviction, maybe even pride. But conviction does not protect a witness from contradiction when the transcript is already sitting on the table. Vance's pen stopped. He looked up from the notes, not with shock, not with triumph, but with the quiet focus of someone who had just heard the door unlock from the inside. He repeated her words back carefully, that she had said, "We made the decision," that she had said she was involved in those conversations. Then he opened his notes to a specific page and reminded her that 12 minutes earlier, she had testified that implementation decisions were handled at the agency level and that her office was not directly involved in program operations. And then the question arrived with no escape route attached. Was she involved in the decision to skip the community consultation she had promised 41 cities, or was she not? That was the kind of question that does not merely ask for information. It forces a political figure to choose which version of the story they want preserved in the record. If Omar was involved, then she had been part of the decision to bypass the very communities she had publicly assured would have a voice. If she was not involved, then the program she authored, championed, defended, and promoted on television had operated beyond her knowledge, while the cities she claimed to protect were left to absorb the fallout. Neither answer was clean, and both answers carried the same insult for the people watching. Either the promise was knowingly sacrificed, or the promise was so poorly guarded that it vanished the moment pressure arrived. Her counsel leaned forward, a senator removed his glasses, a reporter underlined something twice, and behind her, the communications staff stopped pretending this was still a routine oversight hearing. Omar tried to narrow the meaning of "we," saying she was referring to the broader legislative coalition, not a direct operational decision, but the rhythm of her answer had changed. Earlier, she had deployed language. Now, she was selecting it, measuring each word, trying to walk backward through a sentence that had already been captured by microphones, cameras, staff notes, and the committee record. Vance did not overplay it, and that restraint made the moment worse for her, because he simply said he would let the record reflect both statements. That was not mercy. It was preservation. Because in politics, a contradiction does not need to be solved in the room if it can be left alive for every opponent, reporter, voter, and committee member to quote later. Then he moved to the final tab, and the hearing shifted again from mechanics to meaning, from whether the system failed to whether the person defending it could still describe success with a straight face. He asked Omar, in her own words, to state the purpose of the Federal Refugee Community Placement Initiative. She answered in the language she had used 100 times before, about welcoming families fleeing danger, strengthening communities through diversity and investment, and living up to America's highest values. There was nothing surprising in the answer, and that was exactly the problem, because it sounded like it had survived unchanged from the launch event, untouched by the missing funds, untouched by the 7 specialists, untouched by the skipped consultations, untouched by the school cafeterias, serving nearly twice the children they were built to feed. Vance seized on the word, strengthening, because that word had carried the program from the floor speech to the press release, to the cable hits, and into the ears of communities that were now being told their pain was merely imperfect implementation. He asked whether it was still her testimony that FRCPI strengthened the communities that received placements. Omar had to say yes, because the vote was 72 hours away, and reauthorization depended on the fiction that the structure was still sound. She said yes with challenges, yes with imperfect implementation, yes with long-term trajectory, yes in the way politicians say yes when the short-term evidence says no and the future is the only hiding place left. Vance responded with 5 sentences, shorter than anything else he had said all day, each one plain enough to pass through every layer of spin and land directly where the audience lived. The funding did not reach the cities. The specialists were never hired. The job programs did not launch. The consultation never happened. And when the communities wrote to her office asking for help, no one answered. There were no adjectives, no theatrics, no moral sermon, just 5 broken promises placed side by side like evidence bags on a table. Omar gave the most passionate answer of the hearing after that, speaking about the moral arc of the nation, about imperfect implementation not invalidating a righteous mission, about the kind of country America should be when families are fleeing war and persecution. It was eloquent, it was practiced, it was probably sincere, and it missed the target so completely that the miss became its own answer. She was arguing about America's ideals, while Vance had asked about her administration of a program that had failed the communities enlisted to carry those ideals. She was speaking from 30,000 feet, while the parents in those 41 cities were thinking about classrooms, tax bills, unanswered letters, and school board meetings where nobody had a real explanation. And when she finally stopped, Vance did not raise his voice. He simply said 3 words that made the whole performance collapse into silence. You did not answer. But the real strike had not landed yet, because Vance was no longer chasing the budget gap, the missing staff, or even the contradiction about consultation. He was moving toward the one thing Omar could not safely repeat and could not safely abandon. The original promise was still sitting in the record, clean, marketable, and devastating, now that the consequences had arrived. All he had to do was ask her to say it again, and that request would force the entire hearing into one final corner. Because if she repeated the words, she would insult every city that had lived the opposite, and if she refused, she would admit the slogan had died somewhere between the podium and the fallout. Vance opened the final tab, but this time he did not begin with an appropriations table, an internal report, or a GAO assessment. He opened his own handwritten notes from the visits he had made to the Ohio receiving cities, and the change mattered because after nearly an hour of numbers, allocations, gaps, and contradictions, he was no longer asking the room to look at the spreadsheet. He was asking it to look at the consequences. He read about classrooms where children sat on the floor because there were not enough desks, cafeterias where lunch had to be served in shifts because the room could not hold everyone at once, and teachers who had been given no additional resources while being expected to manage rooms full of children speaking multiple languages. He did not blame the refugee families because that would have been too easy, too crude, and too useful to his enemies. Instead, He blamed the political class that invited moral credit for itself and shipped operational collapse to places that did not have lobbyists waiting outside committee rooms. Then his voice changed. Barely, but enough for the microphone to catch it. He talked about children who had been reading at grade level before the program and were not anymore. Not because anyone had set out to fail them. Not because compassion itself was wrong, but because the promised structure never arrived and the local system had been forced to carry a weight it was never built to carry. For once, the stillness around him did not feel like strategy. It felt like restraint, the kind that comes from seeing the damage up close and refusing to turn that damage into cheap theater. And that was the cruel irony of the hearing. The side that kept claiming moral seriousness had spent most of the afternoon dodging the practical meaning of its own morality, while the side accused of cruelty was the one reading from classrooms, tax bills, unanswered letters, and children left inside a broken promise. Vance looked across at Omar and asked her to do something no one else had asked her to do that day. He did not ask for a new explanation, a fresh justification, a revised implementation timeline, or another speech about national values. He asked her to repeat the promise she had made to those communities when the program launched. Not the policy goal, not the humanitarian vision, not the cable news version, but the specific words she had said from the podium. Say them again, he pressed, for every family in those 41 cities watching right now. And that request cut deeper than any accusation, because if the promise was still true, she should have been able to repeat it without hesitation. But if the promise had become politically radioactive, then her silence would say what her testimony would not. Omar did not repeat it. She could not say stronger, not strained, after the hearing had established that the money did not fully arrive. The specialists were barely deployed. The consultation process was used 0 times. The job programs did not launch as promised, and letters from those communities went unanswered. To say those words again would have sounded less like confidence and more like mockery. A polished slogan dropped on families who had already paid the bill for somebody else's press release. So she began a different sentence instead, something careful about continued commitment, lessons learned, implementation challenges, and the work ahead. Different words, softer words, safer words, words designed not to answer the question, but to survive the clip. Vance watched her choose those different words, and that was the point. The promise had been easy when the cameras were fresh, when the program was still theory, when the communities were props in a national story about compassion and investment. But now the communities had names, bills, crowded classrooms, and unanswered letters, and suddenly the slogan that once made the program marketable had become impossible to say out loud. "You kept the podium, Representative," Vance said, almost gently, almost sadly, and the softness made it worse because there was no anger for Omar to push against. "You just forgot the promise." 9 words, and the folder closed. Vance placed both hands flat on the table and stopped moving, while Omar did not respond, not because she chose some grand act of defiance, but because there was no answer left that the room would believe. Her counsel did not lean forward. No staffer rescued her with a note. No friendly senator jumped in fast enough to change the air. 6 full seconds passed, and in modern politics, 6 seconds of silence can be longer than a speech, especially when millions of people understand exactly what is sitting inside it. That silence held every letter unanswered, every city meeting skipped, every classroom overcrowded, every local taxpayer told to finance the difference between what Washington promised and what Washington delivered. Then Vance yielded his remaining time, and he did it without a victory lap, which only made the moment cleaner. He did not summarize, did not raise his voice, did not turn to the cameras and perform the ending for social media, because the ending had already happened. The chairman thanked him, another senator was recognized, and technically the hearing continued, but everyone in the room knew the meaningful part had ended the moment Omar could not repeat her own words. Later, when the chairman offered her a closing statement, she took it, but it was shorter than her opening and noticeably narrower, filled with values, humanitarian commitments, and the work still to be done. What mattered was not what she said, but what she avoided. She did not say stronger, not strained, did not mention the 41 cities, did not return to the letters, did not confront the consultation framework used 0 times, and did not touch the gap between 593 million claimed and 311 million received. The gavel came down, and what had happened in that room was no longer a passing argument, no longer a heated exchange, no longer another clip to be argued over by people who never read the record. It was congressional record now, permanent, searchable, quotable, and sitting there 72 hours before the reauthorization vote, like a knife left on the table. Omar exited through the side door with staff tight around her, no press availability, no hallway interview. Her communications director already on the phone using the familiar emergency vocabulary of political containment. Reframe, context, proactive statement before the evening cycle. She was not destroyed in the cartoonish way the internet likes to imagine politicians are destroyed. She was recalibrating, which is what experienced politicians do when the truth hits the record before their team can sand down the edges. She knew what the clip would be, knew certain communities would travel, knew "we made the decision" would be pulled into reports, and knew the unanswered promise would become the center of the story. Vance walked out through the main entrance, and when a reporter asked if he was satisfied, he gave the kind of answer that denied the press the emotional spike they wanted. He said Representative Omar had volunteered her time. Oversight was how the system worked, and the communities deserved answers before Thursday. Asked about the final exchange, he said the record speaks for itself, and then he walked toward the elevator, letting the phrase do exactly what it was designed to do. By 5 o'clock, the clip was everywhere. Not the full hearing, not the full policy fight, just 93 seconds. Omar's sweeping answer about the moral arc of the nation. Vance's quiet, "You did not answer." The request to repeat the promise. Her refusal to say the words. The line about the podium, and then the silence. It needed no commentary, because the people in those 41 cities did not need to be told what they were looking at. They recognized it instantly. They recognized the gap between announcement and delivery, between compassion as branding and governance as burden, between national applause and local consequence. They recognized the 11% property tax increase, the schools that doubled without enough teachers, the parks left waiting because money had to cover a federal shortfall, and the feeling of being managed by people who would never sit in their school cafeterias or answer questions at their town meetings. The clip did not go viral because it revealed something nobody knew. It went viral because it said out loud what millions of families had already known, that the system can call you a partner while treating you like an afterthought, can promise consultation while making the decision without you, can claim success from a podium while your neighborhood pays for the failure. And for the first time in 18 months, those 41 communities did not feel invisible. They felt like someone had finally put the record where it belonged, in front of the cameras, under oath, and without flinching.